Hey there, deep divers. It's Julie B, and today I'm diving into some key plot developments from Severance Season 2, Episode 6 that still haven't been dealt with since it aired. Now, if you haven't seen Episodes 7 and 8, save this for later because I'll make some references to them in this video. But regarding Episode 6, I'm going to address Mark's encounter with Helena at the Chinese restaurant, Milchick's downward spiral after his abysmal performance review, and Innie Dylan getting closer to his Audie's wife, Gretchen. All of these events are still relevant because we have yet to see the fallout from any of them, since episodes 7 and 8 were unique. The former focused on Mark and Gemma, while the latter focused solely on Cobel. So I think it's important to take a closer look at all of these other plot lines and check back in with these characters before we head into the penultimate episode of the season. So without further ado, let's get into it. First of all, we need to address the situation with Helena approaching Mark at the Chinese restaurant. This is a place we've seen him frequent, something she's probably aware about because the company has people on the payroll all over the town of Kier. The last time she was with Mark, she was masquerading as Helly at the Ortbo retreat, where she slept with his innie and in doing so violated him. He thought he was with Helly, who has a separate identity and separate set of memories. To make matters worse, there's a huge power imbalance here. She's the heir to Lumon, the future CEO, and he's but a lowly severed worker. So it's extremely offensive that she approaches him here in her position of authority over him and with the knowledge of all this, while Mark is oblivious to the fact that she violated him. As he finishes devouring his meal, his ravenous appetite being a symptom of his reintegration, he looks unsettled and taken aback when she catches his eye, smiles at him, then approaches him. Helena feigns ignorance as if this is a chance meeting, which it most certainly is not, saying, "Mark, Scout, I thought that was you." This is downright creepy. She knows exactly who he is and could have picked him out in a crowd from a mile away at this point. But she pretends that she's meeting Mark for the first time. Then he points out that he already knows who she is. Helena notices that he's devoured the food, commenting that she hopes they're feeding him at work. Could she suspect that he's reintegrating? It's possible, but stay tuned for more on that. She asks if she can sit down and apologizes for the systemic error from the other night. He asks if she means the overtime thing, and she awkwardly says, yes, the OTC, then clears her throat and continues, "It never should have happened, and it never will again. We take pride as a company to be better than that, and we will be better." But I don't think she's really referring to the OTC. It's clear that what's really on her mind here is her deception of Mark and violating him, sleeping with him under false pretenses. The way she clears her throat and averts her eyes after saying, yes, the OTC, these are tells. She actually appears to feel some shame about what she did, and she's selfishly trying to find a way to clear her guilty conscience by apologizing to him under the guise of referring to the OTC. But this entire conversation is just yet another violation, because she's still deceiving him, pretending this is their first meeting, and then having the nerve to flirt with him on top of it. Helena tells Mark that she should meet her father sometime, too. A bizarre thing to say to him. He jokes, "You want to take me home to Dad already?" And she replies, "You'd be the first." So now we have flirty banter going on. And this is an interesting revelation here. Apparently, she hasn't been in a significant enough relationship to bring a man home to meet her father, and she seems to have feelings for Mark. The very notion that Helena seems to actually be showing interest in dating Mark's Audie after sleeping with his innie without his knowledge, it's absurd and disgusting. Then she tells Mark, "Seriously, I'd love to hear about your experiences sometime." He asks if she means about Severance, and she replies, "I meant the overtime, I meant the other night." Then she clears her throat again, and once again, this is a tell that she's not being honest regarding what she's really thinking about. Especially since she goes from saying, "I meant the overtime," to cutting herself off and saying, "I meant the other night." She also says, quote, "I can't believe how confusing that must have been," unquote. Helena may be referring to the OTC technically, but In her head, she's clearly thinking of how she slept with him the other night, and how it must have been a confusing experience for his innie. After all, it was his first sexual experience, and his innie is very much like an innocent adolescent. Then he found out that she had deceived him about her identity. Helena is fully aware of all of this, and again, she seems to feel a bit guilty, even as she shamelessly flirts with him here. It also makes me wonder if she's fishing around to see if any memories of that experience could have bled through to his outie, because these statements she's making could apply to their sexual encounter just as much as they could apply to the OTC, and maybe she suspects that romantic feelings could bleed through. Then Helena says, I know you've already been through so much, losing your wife and all, Hannah. This is downright despicable. She pretends she doesn't remember her name, but she obviously knows that Mark's wife's name is Gemma. And much more than that, she knows that her company faked Gemma's death and is holding her prisoner as a test subject. Anyway, Mark looks offended and corrects her to say his wife's name was Gemma. And just when you think Helena can't sink any lower, she says, It was a car accident, right? Such a shame. She was so young. Again, Helena knows very well that his wife is alive and being held prisoner as a test subject, where his innie has unknowingly been tasked with destroying her by refining the Cold Harbor file, and thus he's obliviously helping Lumon torture his own wife and warp her mind. Just let that sink in, and think about her behavior in this scene, acting like she's unaware of all this cruelty and deception. No matter how much her family may have brainwashed her from childhood and coerced her into doing things like getting severed and, this season, impersonating Helly, which I do believe was the result of their coercion, Helena is a despicable person. I believe she's having this meeting with Mark of her own accord, not sent by her family to do reconnaissance on Mark. I think she's just romantically interested in him, which makes her behavior even more reprehensible if it's not a result of her family's coercion. She knows all about what's going on with Gemma, yet she's feigning ignorance and flirting with him, knowing all the while that her company deceived him about his wife's supposed death, deceived him into coming to work for them to gain solace from his grief, and then she personally deceived his innie into sleeping with her. Anyway, then Mark has a coughing fit. She asks if he's all right, and he says he's fine, then gets up to leave. But before he goes, he stops and takes a long stare at her, as if part of his memory of being with her is bleeding through. She looks at him quizzically and clearly notices something is off. Then he rushes out of there. If Helena is aware of the existence of reintegration, as I think she must be, then she might be suspecting him at this point, seeing his strange behavior, including his ravenous appetite, coughing, and that long stare. So what was her motivation in approaching him, though? Again, I think she took it upon herself to do this because she feels romantically drawn to him. I think her feelings for him as an innie have bled through to her outie. I don't think the company sent her to strike up that conversation. However, she still might report back to them about some of his strange behavior. On one of my recent live streams, my guest panelist, Mr. Grant Gregory, pointed out that as Mark rushes out of the restaurant, we can see that most of the sign is dark, except for Fu, which is lit up, and that is a Chinese term for father. And as Mark sits in the front seat of his car, the lit-up word Fu is in the background right next to his face, as if to plant a glaring clue in front of our eyes that Mark is going to be a father. And I agree with Grant that this is a clear case of foreshadowing. Pregnancy has been a ubiquitous theme in this series. There was Devon's pregnancy and childbirth in season 1. There was an innie on the news who was suing Lumon because she got pregnant at work. And there was a state senator's wife getting severed so she wouldn't have to experience childbirth and some of the more unpleasant tasks of motherhood. In the opening credits of season 2, there are many faceless babies crawling around on a bed in which Mark is laying. I think they're symbolic of the blank slate people that Lumon wants to mold into the image of Kier through the chips, as evidenced by the baby at the end of the credits who has Kier's face. But regardless, still more baby imagery and baby themes. And most importantly, Mark and Gemma tried and failed to conceive a child, attempting IVF treatments but to no avail. Their infertility battle was what led to Mark and Gemma coming into Lumon's crosshairs in the first place, as they wound up at a Lumon fertility clinic, as we learned in episode 7. Lumon's logo was on the paperwork, and Dr. Maurer could be seen walking through the waiting room. All of these pregnancy references could be foreshadowing that Helly/Helena will end up pregnant due to her encounter with Mark's innie. Add all of that to the piece of foreshadowing with the Chinese restaurant sign, and I predict that this is going to happen. Helly/Helena being pregnant will pose a serious problem for all involved. If the baby was conceived during the Orpo with Helena, Helly will feel more violated than ever, forced to carry a child she never asked for, a product of her outie using the body they share to sleep with Mark. And even if the baby was conceived with Helly, as Mark also slept with her innie in episode 6, it would be bittersweet for Mark after his wife's inability to conceive, and due to the fact that Mark's innie wouldn't be able to raise his own child, and probably wouldn't be allowed to see the child in the outie visitation center either. Then there's this messy situation. How would we know which one conceived the child, Helly or Helena? The timeline is unclear, but the sexual encounters may have happened too close together to tell, and Helly will never be able to know for sure, which would have to gnaw at her. Some fans theorized that Lumon specifically sent Helena to pose as Helly in order to get pregnant by Mark, but I don't see what the motivation for that could be. I don't think there's anything that special about Mark that would make the Egans want her to get pregnant with his child. If anything, I don't think they'd like it. After all, the Egans view innies as subhuman, and they probably view even the outies, the severed workers, as a much lower class than them, with all their money and power. Mark is only special to Lumon because only he has the ability to complete Gemma's Cold Harbor file, which I've discussed at length in my 2 theory videos on Gemma and Lumon's endgame, which are linked in the description of this video. So I think Helena's motivation was purely selfish, and she slept with Mark of her own volition. She was longing for the love, respect, and appreciation that she's never known in her life, in which she realized that Helly had with Mark. It's truly twisted. Recall how in episode 2 there was a close-up on Helena's eye as she watched the surveillance footage of Helly and Mark kissing. She wants what Helly has, and that may also be at least partially due to Helly's feelings for Mark bleeding through to her. Now moving on to Milchick. He is left reeling from his abysmal performance review. He calls in Ms. Wong and she passive-aggressively asks how it went, knowing full well that it would have gone terribly and enjoying this fact. Then he takes the opportunity to use what little power he has and holds it over her head, telling her, "I feel I should remind you, you cannot graduate from this fellowship until I have deemed you wintertide material. This will mean using your time well, focusing on your own duties, and eradicating from your essence childish folly." Incidentally, this part about eradicating childish folly sounds like projection on his part, something that he feels he needs to do, as we'll see later. But at any rate, this confirms that Ms. Wong is working there thanks to this wintertide fellowship, most likely living at the Egan School for Girls as Cobel did, something that I've been theorizing about all season. And she's being brainwashed by the cult of Kier, just as Miss Cobel has been. Milchick is reminding her to focus on her own duties and use her time well. In other words, stop dwelling on what he should or should not be doing. He must have realized that she's the only one who could have anonymously reported him to the board about his violations, such as attaching paper clips incorrectly. So he's reminding her that he still has ultimate authority over her. And as he speaks to her, he even glances over at that dreaded performance review that still continues to haunt him. After being eviscerated by the board, he's flaunting his power on the severed floor, where he actually still has control. But inside, he's reeling from the rejection from this company and cult, whose approval he craves more than anything. To that end, while he allows Ms. Wong to watch over the severed floor on his behalf for the rest of the day, he won't allow her to sit at his desk and get too comfortable in that role. And what is it that will keep him so busy for the rest of the day? Well, he goes into the storage room behind his office and spends hours attaching paper clips to a giant stack of papers in the correct manner, until his hands are actually shaking. It's like a self-inflicted punishment for this perceived failing, absurd though it may seem to us, and he's determined to never repeat this mistake again and to become worthy of the approval of the cult of Kier. When he finishes, after glancing over at his scathing performance review, he looks in a mirror and berates himself in an increasingly aggressive manner. He says, "You must eradicate from your essence childish folly." This is something that he had just told Ms. Wong that she needs to do, but clearly he's berating himself that he must do the same thing. He says, "You must eradicate from yourself childish folly. You must abandon childish things. You must grow up." Then he repeats that line, "grow up," several times, followed by simply "grow, grow," over and over again until his voice becomes more like a fierce growl. At the start of his performance review, Drummond had said that it could last anywhere from 4 to 6 hours, depending on how many atonements were necessary. And I'm guessing that he had to repeat these phrases over and over again at that meeting for hours as this atonement, similar to the way innies used to be forced to repeat a kind of atonement statement in the break room. This season, we've gotten a window into the human side of Milchick, as the show is fleshing out his character, showing his deep insecurities and desperation for approval from Lumon. It's confirmed my long-standing belief that he's a true believer in the cult of Kier, brainwashed, not just playing along as part of his job. This is why Milchick was so troubled by the blackface Kier paintings he received earlier this season. He experienced conflicting feelings, cognitive dissonance. It made him feel uncomfortable, of course, as a person of color, but he is so loyal to this cult that he didn't know how to process these feelings. He felt compelled to talk about them to Natalie as another person of color, but only in coded and carefully worded phrases. So what happens now? Well, now that he's been so mercilessly chastised by Lumon, Milchick will most certainly change his approach to managing the severed floor in a desperate attempt to gain the approval of the cult. He's always treated the severed workers more like human beings than anyone else in the company up to this point, but that's already starting to change. As he told Drummond, he's tightening the leash, starting with getting in Mark's face as he leaves work 6 minutes early and speaks irreverently about Kier. In response to this, Milchick asks Mark if he's told Helly yet that he had sex with Helena at the Ortbo. This is a truly ugly side of Milchick we've never seen before, a vicious side. To throw that in Mark's face after he had been violated by Helena under false pretenses. And I expect to see more of this new nasty Milchick going forward. No more lighthearted music dance experience Milchick from season 1. He might even revoke some of the kindness reforms that he had instituted this season, such as hall passes and the torture-free break room. While I do think he'll continue to allow Dylan to visit Gretchen, that's not an act of kindness. He needed to find a new way to motivate Dylan to be productive after he screwed up and woke Dylan up on the outside in season 1, where he discovered that he has a son as a result. This was a game changer, and Milchick realized that trivial perks like finger traps were no longer going to be enough of an incentive for Dylan to complete his work. And in this vein, the last piece of this episode that I want to address is Dylan's visit with his Audie's wife, Gretchen. Dylan wants to know more about their relationship on the outside and his Audie's hobbies. Gretchen admits that he's dabbled in a number of things in phases, and she sometimes wonders if he's just not happy. Innie Dylan can't fathom this because he says he's always happy to be with her at these visits and wishes they could really be together all the time. He asks if they can hug again, which he says he liked. Of course, because human beings have a basic need for touch, and this is something of which the innies are cruelly deprived. The hug later turns into a kiss, as Gretchen seems to be developing more feelings for Innie Dylan than his Audie self. Later at dinner with Audie Dylan, she lies and says that she didn't visit his innie that day. She seems to recognize that what she's done basically constitutes cheating on him, because his innie is essentially a separate person with a separate set of memories. This situation is going to continue to pose a problem in their relationship, and eventually he'll probably catch her in her lies. Maybe what she likes about Innie Dylan is that his chip eliminated his biggest flaws, his unreliability, lack of work ethic, and lack of commitment to stick with any one thing for long. Say what you will about these chips, but in some ways they do seem to bring out the best in the MDR crew. Innie Mark is more emotionally open and sensitive to others, while his outie is emotionally closed off and insensitive. Helly is bold and courageous, while her outie kowtows to her family and follows their orders. And Innie Irving was able to form close bonds with his coworkers, while his outie seems to be a loner with only his dog for company. So that was my deep dive into more key plot points from Season 2, Episode 6. And now I want to know what you think. Why do you think Helena sought out Mark at the restaurant? Could she suspect that he's reintegrating, or is it just that she has romantic feelings for him? Why is Milchick so desperate for Lumon's approval, and how do you think his handling of the severed workers will change going forward? And what could be the repercussions of Gretchen cheating with Innie Dillon? And why do you think Innie Dillon is so much more attractive to her than his outie? What is it about these chips that's changing the way the innies operate and improving them, to be honest, improving some of their characteristics, some of their biggest stumbling blocks on the outside? Let me know your thoughts and theories in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and check out my live Severance Deep Dives on Mondays at 10:30 p.m. Eastern. And until next time, keep on deep diving, and let's see what we can uncover together.